The year was 1991, and the last time Brian O'Toole saw his 32-year-old wife, Patricia, was in the car park of the First National Building Society in Booterstown in South Dublin. After their appointment, Brian walked Patricia back to her car, a white Peugeot 205. They chatted for around 10 minutes, discussing what they were both doing that afternoon. Patricia worked for an insurance company on Mount Street in the city centre, and Brian worked as a bouncer at Buck Whaley's nightclub on Leeson Street. Patricia planned to go out after work with her colleagues, as one of them was leaving the company, and so they were all going to Scruffy Murphy's pub for a few drinks, which was just off Mount Street, near where they all worked. Brian was not due to work until later that evening, and so he hoped to fit in a game of golf with his friends before work. Before they parted, Brian asked Patricia if she was having a few drinks not to drive home and stay with one of her friends that night. Patricia also mentioned that she planned to visit her sister and her husband the following day and spend the day with them. This would have been a regular occurrence on a Saturday, so kissing her goodbye and telling her how beautiful she looked, Brian was under the impression that if his wife did not return home that night, he would not see her again until the following evening. Brian watched his wife step back into her car and drive off. This, like many other cases, was the last time he saw his wife alive. Brian returned to the house he shared with Patricia in Killiney, and that afternoon was picked up by a friend and they drove to their favourite golf course. They were unable to secure a game there, and so they drove to Greystones in County Wicklow. But there was a competition already underway, so again they moved on to another club. Finally, they got a start of a game, but abandoned it after 3 holes, because of the long delays on each tee. They were refunded their money and had a couple of drinks in the clubhouse instead. When they finished there, they went back to Killiney to a pub called the Graduate, leaving there at around 8:45 p.m. when his friend dropped Brian home to get ready for work. Brian started work at 10:45 p.m. that Friday evening, the 30th of August, and would work through to after 6 a.m. the next morning. When he arrived home, he noticed Patricia's car was not in the driveway, and when he entered the house, it was empty. He thought to himself that she must have taken his advice and stayed at a friend's house the night before. Brian went to bed for a couple of hours, and by 9 a.m. he was out of the house again, playing golf. This time he was successful in getting a game, and so did not return to the house until 4:15 p.m. With still no sign of Patricia, he took it that by now she was visiting her sister, so Brian grabbed a few hours' sleep before being due into work again. The following morning, when he returned home from work after 6 a.m, there was still no sign of Patricia. It was now Sunday, and Brian was worried. She should have been home by now. But he did have thoughts that maybe she had stayed with her sister the night before. He waited until 10 a.m. to ring his sister-in-law, as he thought ringing her at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning would not go down too well in the house. When he rang Anne, she told Brian that they had not seen Patricia all weekend. When he rang her work colleagues that Patricia had been out with on the Friday evening, they gave him the same answer. They did mention that Patricia was pretty full of drink, and one couple told him that they had a meal with Patricia in the Pronto Grill restaurant in Ranelagh and had left them around 1:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, intending to drive home. Around the time Brian was ringing everyone he knew that Patricia might be with, the Gardaí at Harcourt Street had received a call that a white car had been abandoned at Dolphin Road in Drimnagh, where it was first noticed the previous Saturday morning. When Gardaí arrived to inspect the car, it was noted it was a white Peugeot 205, and although parked in a haphazard way, it did not seem to be broken into, crashed, or reported missing or stolen. When they checked the licence plate number, it came back to one Patricia Madden, who lived in Killiney. Madden was Patricia's maiden name. As Brian was ringing around, he was also listening to the radio, and on hearing the 11 o'clock news, he heard that a woman had been found dead in the Dublin Mountains the previous morning. As the description of the woman was given, he was not concerned, as the description given did not match Patricia. But when the wedding ring was described, he did take note, as it was a 3-band Russian ring that he knew he had bought Patricia as a present in Grafton Street 5 years earlier. When he heard this, he contacted the Gardaí. When he spoke to Gardaí, he relayed the last time he saw his wife on the Friday, and he gave details of her vehicle she was driving. When the Gardaí checked the vehicle, it came back as being found on Dolphins Road, abandoned. Brian then officially reported his wife missing, in order for the Gardaí to progress the investigation. Suspecting that the woman found murdered in the Dublin Mountains was somewhat connected, Brian was summoned to Cabinteely Garda Station and asked to bring photographs of Patricia. He was interviewed for 4 hours. Gardaí returned to the car found abandoned with fresh eyes and examined the white Peugeot. They noticed that the car was unlocked, but there was no keys. 2 pairs of shoes and a blue coat were found in the footwell of the passenger side. A handbag containing credit cards, a purse, documentation and a checkbook containing the name Patricia Madden and Patricia O'Toole. This proved beyond doubt that this was indeed Patricia's car. The Gardaí also noticed heavy blood staining on the inside panelling of the driver's door, and more blood on the outside handle of the passenger door and the rear boot lock. Forensics were called, and soon they provided a vital clue that would be able to rule out any suspect that arose in the investigation. From the steering wheel of the car, they recovered a palm print left in blood. A comparison was made to the body found in the Dublin Mountains, and it did not match. It was determined it was left by the killer. A clump of hair was also removed from the central console, which would match the body found. That Sunday evening, with Gardaí certain that they had identified the body in the Dublin Mountains, they brought Brian in to Tallaght Garda Station to identify the rings they had found on the body. The gold wedding band he couldn't identify for certain, as it was quite common, but when he saw the Russian wedding band, he knew for certain it belonged to Patricia. He would later tell the court, quote, "When our wedding bands dropped on the table, my whole life ended." Patricia's brother-in-law Peter was to be the first to identify her body, and later when the body was prepared, Brian would also identify her as his wife. Such was the extent of her injuries to her face, that to be certain her dental records had also to be used. Brian said later, quote, "I went into the morgue prepared for it to be very bad, but it was worse than I could ever imagine. I walked outside to try and get sick, but I couldn't." Peter would say that Patricia's injuries were so bad, Brian couldn't even kiss her goodbye. Patricia, or Tricia as she was known to her friends, was classed as a striking-looking woman. Her good looks and quick wit made her very popular and centre of attention on many an occasion. She was a well-liked person, full of life and always up for the crack. She was born on the 12th of April 1959 and was the youngest daughter to Patrick and Pauline Madden. She had a good upbringing in Baldoyle on the north side of Dublin, along with her sister Anne. At school, she was exceptionally bright, and when leaving school in 1976, she achieved 4 honours. She then took a secretarial course at Rose College and worked as a temp in several offices in the city over the next few years. She did go to Greece, but returned in the 80s and took her final job with the insurance company on Mount Street in the centre of Dublin. By 1984, she had met Brian. He worked as a marketing consultant, and they began a relationship and bought a house together in Killiney in 1986. On the 16th of August 1990, they got married. Patricia was popular and outgoing, with a wide and varied circle of friends, and she had a love for sport and fitness, just like her husband. Brian was a rugby player and keen golfer. Patricia was more into keeping fit and worked out, attending a gym several times a week. She was also a keen runner and competed in several half marathons. In March 1991, she took a course in physical education to become an instructor in aerobics fitness. Her and Brian moving to LA was also on the cards, as he had a job offer out there, and she was hoping to set up her own studio there also. Once all the dots were connected between the car and Patricia's body being formally identified, a full-scale murder investigation was launched, and Patricia's final movements were soon established. After work on the evening of Friday the 30th of August 1991, Patricia, as she had told Brian, joined her work colleagues for leaving drinks. They arrived at Scruffy Murphy's pub just after 5 p.m. and remained drinking until just after 10:30 p.m. The manager recalled that Patricia was in great form. She was always a very happy girl, joking and having a laugh when she came up to the bar to order a drink. He said the friends were having a good time but were not drunk. The group left the pub and went to a local takeaway called Abracababra, which I can attest to. They have great tacos. After this, the group headed to Russell's pub in Ranelagh, which was outside the city centre. It was a very busy pub as it was Friday night, and so they did not stay long. O'Brien's pub was their next stop, which they stayed in until 12:30 a.m. It was then that Patricia and a couple decided to go to Pronto Grill restaurant, and this is when Patricia decided to drive. The couple offered to walk her to her car, but she declined. She said she was going to Saks Hotel in Donnybrook, which was later renamed the Hampton Hotel, but she would never arrive. This would be the last time anyone that knew her would see her alive. 5 hours later, her body would be found on Mount Venus Road at the foothills of the Dublin Mountains. Now that the Gardaí had established Patricia's movements on the Friday evening, it helped them greatly, and along with the discovery of her car, the investigation now shifted to Drimnagh, where her car was found. Patricia was so friendly, she was known to pick up total strangers, and although her body was found 9 miles away from where the car was found, it was felt she picked up someone, was attacked and brought to the Dublin Mountains, murdered, and then the car was abandoned to where it was found. The Gardaí felt that the killer was from this area. On Monday, Gardaí circulated photographs of Patricia to the media and appealed to anyone who may have seen Patricia in the early hours of that Saturday morning to come forward. A reconstruction of Patricia's movements was also televised in order to jog people's memories. On the 3rd of September 1991, Patricia's body was removed and brought to St. Peter and Paul's Church in Baldoyle, and her funeral took place the next day. A large group of family and friends gathered, offering sympathy to her husband Brian and her father Patrick and sister Anne, and extended family. Patricia's mother had died in 1989. By this time, people had started to contact Gardaí with information. One caller said he had come across the white Peugeot at around 1:45 a.m. on that Saturday morning on the South Circular Road in the Dolphins Barn area. As he was dropping off a friend, a small white car driving erratically by a long blonde-haired woman pulled up alongside of him and asked him for directions to Inchicore. When he had given her directions, she pulled off, veering all over the road. When the caller was brought in and shown photographs, he identified Patricia as the driver. The next sighting was in Inchicore. 2 men waiting at a junction had a car come up alongside them, and a blonde female driver stopped and asked for directions to number 56 Connolly Avenue. They did direct her to the place, but instead of going in the direction that was given to her, she continued the wrong way. 2 other men would also meet the white Peugeot. They said as she asked them for directions, she seemed to be upset, drunk and unfit to drive. They told her she was very near to Connolly Avenue and gave her more directions. They also identified her through photographs. Also, another driver came forward and said he had pulled up alongside Patricia at the traffic lights. He said he had stopped alongside her to complain to her about her erratic driving. He also said what the other witnesses said. She was upset and appeared to be drunk. Patricia had also asked him for directions to Connolly Avenue, and he explained that he was going in that direction and for her to follow him. However, when he turned right onto Connolly Avenue, the white Peugeot was no longer behind him, having turned off onto one of the other streets. He did a U-turn in order to find the white car, concerned that the woman may injure herself or someone else. He couldn't find her and so continued on home to his own house. He too would identify Patricia from the photographs. The sightings of Patricia were within a very small geographic area of Dublin, and it seems she was going around in circles, and she could not get her bearings, because she was stressed, upset and intoxicated. I've got lost in Dublin sober, and it was stressful, so I can imagine the state poor Patricia was in. The Gardaí believed that the reason Patricia was looking for Connolly Avenue was because an old boyfriend of hers lived on that street. They had first met 13 years ago, and they had an on and off relationship for several years. When Gardaí spoke to the ex-boyfriend, he told them he had not seen or spoken to Patricia since September of the previous year, and they had no contact that night and no arrangements had been made to meet up. Why Patricia decided to call to him that night, nobody knows, but this was before texting was a thing, and I think we all are familiar with drunk calling or texting, which is a big no-no. I'm not suggesting there was anything untoward, but unfortunately sometimes people don't have closure from past relationships, and this becomes more apparent when drunk. The progress of the investigation was being scrutinised by the media, and there was fierce pressure on the Gardaí to solve this murder. The whole nation was in shock over it. Many appeals were further made, and the response from the public was good. But of course the media ran with scandalising the case. If it wasn't enough that Patricia was murdered, the newspapers had headlines implying that Patricia, only being married a year, was carrying on behind her husband's back, and they were in financial difficulty. Brian, Patricia's husband, would deny this. On the 8th of September, a newspaper ran a front page cover of the murder, a large photograph of Patricia asking the question, did Patricia ask her murderer for directions? This was also what the Gardaí were asking and thought it was the most probable. 10 days after the murder, 2 men came forward with a tale, and the information was so damning that the Gardaí immediately went to a house on the Colmore Road. Here lived a 20-year-old woman, Rosalind Holland. She was very distressed, but told her story to the detectives, which would lead to a killer. She told them that on the morning of Saturday, the 31st of August, at around 4 a.m, she was walking along a road in the Dolphins Barn area, returning home after a night out with her boyfriend, 25-year-old Sean Courtney, who was a soldier. She told the detectives that as they were walking, a small white car stopped and a blonde woman driving asked them for directions. Rosalind said she did not know the address the woman was looking for, but her boyfriend said he did. Patricia did not understand the directions she was being given, as she was either too upset or too drunk, Rosalind said. She asked the couple to get into the car so they could take her there directly. Rosalind and Sean only agreed to go with her if Patricia would drop Rosalind off at her house first, and once Sean showed her where the house was, she would then drop Sean back to his girlfriend's. Patricia dropped Rosalind off as agreed, and Sean and Patricia went on. Rosalind said she looked at the clock when she got in, and it was 4:10 a.m. She said she waited another 30 minutes for Sean to return, but he didn't. When he failed to return, she eventually fell asleep. When she woke up later that morning, between 8 and 9 a.m, she heard the sound of gravel and coins hitting her bedroom window. Outside was Sean waiting on the wall. When she went down to confront him about where he was all night, he claimed that he had slept on the steps outside because he couldn't wake her. They then both went back to bed, and she recalled how Sean had held her tightly as they lay there. Rosalind said she recoiled from him as he was so deathly cold. 9 days later, Sean had shown her the newspaper with Patricia's photograph as front page news, and admitted to her that he was the one that killed her. Though she could not believe what he was telling her, she did recognise Patricia as the person they had been in the car with that night. The detectives returned to the incident room that had been set up in Tallaght Garda Station, and from there they arranged to go to the army barracks, where Sean was on a 24-hour duty that day. Forensics were sent to Rosalind's house, where they collected the clothes Sean was wearing the night of the murder. At 12:30 a.m, 2 detectives arrived at the army barracks and arrested Sean Courtney and brought him to Tallaght Garda Station for questioning. Courtney waived his right to rest and began telling the detectives his version of what happened that night. So who is Sean Courtney? He was the only son of a bus driver and part-time cleaner, Matthew and Mary Courtney. It was his boyhood dream to become a soldier. When he was a child, he was painfully shy and was bullied quite badly. At the age of 12, he took an overdose and spent 2 weeks in hospital. When he got out, he changed schools. When he was 16, he tried to enlist in the army, taking after an uncle who he adored and who he looked up to. But alas, he was too young and was rejected. Courtney was also a talented artist and got a job with a sign company designing for them. He only ever got into trouble once, when he was 14, but this was resolved and so he had no criminal record. He met his future wife Amanda in 1983 and they would go on to have 2 children. He finally got his chance to join the army in 1985 and was stationed at Cahill Barracks in Rathmines in Dublin. He joined the transport platoon, being taught how to drive trucks and armoured cars. He had a very good reputation within the army walls, and his superiors said he would have gone far in his career. In 1987, he volunteered to go overseas to Lebanon as part of the UN peacekeeping duties. It was a 6-month tour and uneventful. He would volunteer 2 more times to go to the Lebanon as the money was so good, but the 3rd trip he would not complete. On his 2nd tour, the post he was assigned to came under heavy fire, and a short time after this, he was on a road checkpoint where he was forced to open fire on a Christian militiaman when he pointed a gun at him and his colleagues. Courtney was then transferred for his own safety, as he claimed he had shot the Christian in the leg and therefore under threat by the Israeli army. Towards the end of this tour, Courtney would have another setback when he said he witnessed his friend shoot himself by accident in a toilet cubicle. This, Courtney would claim, had a profound effect on him, and he would go on to use it as part of his defence in court, saying he suffered from PTSD after the incident. When he got home from this tour, Courtney and Amanda's marriage was on a downhill spiral. Amanda would say that he had not given her money and he drank very heavily. To try and sort things out between them and to get some space between them, Courtney volunteered once again to go overseas. 2 days into this tour, he went to the medical, complaining he was ill. Deemed unfit, he was sent home a week later. When he arrived home, he was sent to the military psychiatric hospital for treatment and released a few days later as an outpatient. And Amanda moved out and in with Courtney's parents. This is when he would meet Rosalind Holland on a night out. He would begin a relationship with her and would tell Amanda. He soon moved out of the marital home and in with Rosalind, and in turn Amanda moved back into the house with her 2 boys. As for the events of the night Patricia was murdered, Courtney told the detectives that on the weekend of the 30th of August he was off duty for the whole weekend, and so he and Rosalind decided to go out on the Friday night, and they had gone to a disco. He said he had drunk 12 to 13 pints that night and was very intoxicated. Rosalind would contradict this part of the statement. She said he had only 6 pints, as he gets drunk very easily, as he would not drink that often. He said when they left the disco, they went back to a friend's house, and at some time in the early hours of the morning, he and Rosalind decided to walk home. As they walked home, a white Peugeot pulled up alongside them. A blonde-haired woman was driving, and she asked them for directions to Connolly Avenue. Courtney said he had a fair idea where this was, and proceeded to tell the woman, but he said she didn't seem to understand. He offered to show her where it was, and Patricia agreed, and so they both got into the car. Rosalind sat in the back, and Courtney sat in the front. Courtney asked Patricia to drop Rosalind at the house, and Patricia said she would, and that she would drop him back after he had shown her where she needed to go. Rosalind was dropped off and Courtney went with Patricia. Rosalind did confirm Courtney's statement up to this moment. The following part of the statement of what happened after Rosalind was dropped off is Courtney's version of events that for obvious reasons cannot be confirmed. It's his word only. On the way to Connolly Avenue, Patricia stopped the car at a junction that had 5 roads. He said the conversation was pleasant and Patricia was very chatty, asking Courtney questions about himself, which he proceeded to answer. Then Patricia made the statement, according to Courtney, quote, "You never know who you are picking up in a car at this time of night. I could get you done for attacking me. If I went to the Gardaí, it would be your word against mine." Courtney said, quote, "She was laughing at me and thinking it was a big joke." Courtney said that this statement to him affected him, as a work colleague had been accused of something similar and had been imprisoned for 9 years, and he didn't believe him to be guilty. He continued to say, quote, "I didn't know what to think. I just blew a fuse. I went mad. I was sitting in the front passenger seat. I hit her a few punches in the face. She went semi-conscious and fell over towards me." Courtney opened the passenger door and got out and pulled Patricia over onto the passenger seat and got into the driver's seat. He said he didn't know what to do, so he just drove off in the car with the semi-conscious Patricia. He said he headed towards the mountains and was panicking the whole time. When he had got as far as Mount Venus Road at the foot of the Dublin Mountains, Patricia came to and started to scream. Courtney pulled in at a gateway and grabbed Patricia by the throat. The passenger door flew open and she fell halfway out of the car, with her legs still inside. Patricia dragged the rest of her body out and started moving backwards on her back, away from the car, using her hands and legs to push. Courtney followed her out the passenger door towards her. Patricia was kicking and screaming and fighting to get away. Courtney would say again, quote, "I just went mad. I picked up a rock and started hitting her head and face, blow after blow, sometimes using my 2 hands to rain down the blows." This went on until Patricia's screams fell silent. He said then, which I wouldn't believe in a month of Sundays, that as her screams became silent, she managed to say to him, in her dying breath, "Don't ruin your life." He said she was barely breathing, and then it stopped. Courtney said when everything was silent, he felt the whole situation was surreal, that he was not really part of what happened, that he was more of an onlooker looking down from above. But he soon got over this as he grabbed the keys from the ignition and opened the boot of the car, planning to put Patricia in it and leave the car somewhere. But then he decided this was not a good idea. He proceeded to take all her clothes off and threw them in the field. He told detectives that he wanted to make it look like it was a sexually motivated crime. He said her shoes were on the road, so he threw them in the passenger window of the car as it was open. He then got into the driver's seat and started the car, leaving Patricia's naked and battered body on the side of the road. At first, he could not find the reverse, but when he did, he felt a bump and he thought he might have hit the body, but he didn't get out to check. He just put it in first gear and drove off. Courtney said he headed back towards the city and ended up on Dolphins Road, where he abandoned the car. As he walked home, he threw the keys to the car into the canal, and he also washed his hands in the canal as they were covered in blood. When he arrived back to the house he shared with Rosalind, he could not get in as he had no keys, and so he ended up sleeping on the steps until finally Rosalind woke up. As the clothes he was wearing that night were dark, a dark navy shirt, trousers and socks, and dark shoes and a paisley tie, Rosalind never noticed any blood on his clothes, and when he took them off he rolled everything up into a ball and left them on the floor at the end of the bed. As he lay in bed he wrapped himself around Rosalind, trying to understand what just happened and why it happened. He was in shock, but it didn't seem to affect his sleep, as he did not wake up until 3 p.m. later that day. When he got up, he put his clothes that were covered in blood into the wash, but forgot the tie he was wearing, which was covered in blood splatter. He then watched the football match on TV and went and got a takeaway. When he was on the way home, he went and bought a newspaper. The front page told of a woman's body being found on Mount Venus Road that morning. When he got back to the house with the takeaway, Rosalind noticed Courtney was very quiet, but she would say later that when she thought back to Courtney's behaviour, there was no real big change in him, that the following day he even played a football match and attended a football training that week also. People that were in his company, whether socially or work-wise, saw no change in him at all, and he carried on as normal. But by the 9th of September, Courtney was beginning to feel the pressure. Everywhere he looked he saw Patricia's face, whether it was in the newspapers, on the TV, or reliving that night. Patricia was haunting him, and he was cracking up. On the 10th of September, he finally told Rosalind what he had done. He showed her the newspaper with Patricia on the front page and said, quote, "I done that. I killed her. I really made a feck of it this time." Shaking and crying, he told Rosalind that he had not meant to do it. Rosalind asked him did he rape her, and he told her, "Look, it says in the newspaper she wasn't," and he said he didn't. He begged Rosalind not to tell anyone and returned to Cahill barracks, where he was on 24-hour duty. Rosalind did not keep any promises and went around to some friends distraught, eventually telling 2 of her friends. They in turn then contacted the Gardaí, and the rest I've already told you. On the 11th of September, Courtney was officially charged with Patricia's murder after bringing the detectives on a tour of the route he took from the city to the Dublin Mountains, also showing them where he threw the ignition keys in the canal and where he had washed Patricia's blood off his hands. During the hearing, Courtney stood in the court and said nothing, but looked nervous and unsteady on his feet. He was refused bail and remanded in custody at Mountjoy Prison. But 4 weeks later this would be reviewed, and he was released on a personal surety of £1,000 and an independent surety of £10,000. The conditions also included that he would stay on military property and take any psychiatric medical help he was advised to. Ahead of his trial date and while out on bail, Courtney gave an interview to the newspapers. He told them that he was allowed to visit his parents and that his friends told him to flee the country, but he refused to, claiming he couldn't do that to his mother, that she had been through enough already. On the 13th of January 1993, Courtney finally got his day in court. As was his right, he appeared in full uniform, and while this is not against army rules, it would have been frowned upon and seen as disrespectful to the uniform and what it stood for. A would-be murderer having the neck to stand there in full uniform. Courtney would continue to do this for the entirety of the trial, as he was still an active member of the army, and it was law at the time. He pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to murder and insane. The defence used Courtney's experience in the Lebanon and how he had suffered from PTSD as a result. They would say how he was perfectly normal, had a wife and children, that his time in the army was exemplary, up until his experience on his second tour overseas. After this, his life fell apart, including his marriage, his mental health, and how drinking had become a big part of his life also. The state pathologist Dr. Harbison was the first to give evidence of Patricia's injuries. The injuries were consistent with being struck with a brick which was found beside the body. The brick was covered with Patricia's blood and traces of her hair. The cause of death was inhalation of blood. In other words, she drowned in her own blood. He said that it was a violent and prolonged attack which continued after her death. There were also drag marks on her buttocks and legs and defense wounds on her legs and arms. Basically, she fought for her life. He said there was no clear evidence of a sexual assault, even though there was bruising on her inner thigh and genital area. All witness statements were then read out. Rosalind took to the stand and broke down several times as she relayed meeting Patricia that night. Courtney also took to the stand in his own defence. While on the stand in his uniform, he relayed what he had told detectives, sobbing and telling the court he was sorry. Brian, Patricia's husband, did not attend the court when Courtney was giving his account of what he had done to Patricia. He couldn't stomach hearing how his beautiful new bride had suffered under him. Psychiatrists would contradict the defence of their claim that Courtney was insane. They believed his judgment was impaired, that the PTSD combined with alcohol had affected his conduct at the time of the killing. On the 21st of January 1993, the 7 men and 5 women of the jury retired to deliberate. A 10-2 verdict of guilty of the murder of Patricia by Courtney was returned. The whole court erupted with joy when the verdict was read out. There was such a disruption in the court that some people had to be expelled from the court. Courtney was sentenced immediately. He stood ashen-faced with his head down as the judge handed down the mandatory life in prison. Courtney made no response. That is, until the judge left the courtroom and his mask slipped. As he was being led from the dock and passing Patricia's husband, father and sister, her extended family and friends, he shouted, quote, "She was only a fucking tramp." Anne, Patricia's sister, spoke to the press afterwards, saying, quote, "I know he will only serve around 10 years. What I would really like is for the army to bring him out and put him in front of a firing squad." Patricia's father believed that Courtney tried it on with Patricia and she rejected him. He assaulted her physically and killed her, and then in the court he assaulted her verbally. It shows the contrition he had for his deed. Brian did not make any statement after the court. Instead, his friends gathered around him and brought him for a game of golf. This I understand. On the 10th of February, Courtney was dishonourably discharged from the army. Courtney appealed his conviction, and in 1994 it was rejected. In 2008, after 15 years in prison, Courtney received temporary Christmas release privileges and then a temporary day release from the open prison in Cavan. He was then put in the pre-release training unit at Mountjoy Prison after being described as a model prisoner. In 2009, while on this release programme, and after communicating with a woman, Louise O'Neill from Limerick, he met with her and she became pregnant. Again, it's amazing what day release can get you. When word got out, the people of Ireland were disgusted and said it was a disgrace that he was allowed to begin a new life, while Brian was denied the right with his wife of a year. The Courtney camp also had something to say. They said he had served his time and was remorseful, and that every year on the anniversary of Patricia's death, he asked the chaplain to dedicate the Mass to her in her memory. Oh, get me a bucket. By 2012, Courtney was allowed out of prison on extended leave, including full weekends to spend time with his partner and their child. A job in a mechanic's garage was also secured for him, and this was 5 days a week from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. On the 1st of March 2013, Courtney was released on licence from Mountjoy Prison, and he went to live in Sligo with Louise and their 3-year-old son. He is not allowed to drink or frequent any pubs or clubs as part of his release licence. Amanda, his ex-wife, condemned Courtney's release, saying he should have stayed there until he died. It is said that Courtney, Louise and their child moved back to Dublin, but their whereabouts are actually unknown. My personal opinion is Courtney lied about offering to show Patricia where Connolly Avenue was, and then getting her to drive him back to the house he shared with Rosalind. There was no way she was in any state to take directions, but then expected to drive to Connolly Avenue, back to the house, and then find her way again to Connolly Avenue. This makes no sense at all. As I've said, I have been lost in Dublin and have asked taxi drivers for directions, and still I managed to get lost. Dublin is huge today as it was back then. I think he had no intention of getting her to her destination. He saw a beautiful, vulnerable woman, and on a pretense to get her on her own, offered to go with her. I think he punched Patricia to subdue her and travelled the 9 miles to the Dublin Mountains to a quiet spot in order to rape her. I think by the time he got there, Patricia came round and realised what was going to happen, and she fought him off. I think he either couldn't get it up because of drink or he was impotent, and he took his frustration and anger out on her. Why would you want to make it look like a sex-related murder rather than a murder? What difference would that make? How would it throw investigators off? Courtney's sister Martina has spoken out against him over the years. She said his actions tore their family apart. She said every year on the anniversary of Patricia's death, she puts flowers on her grave. In the same interview, she spoke how she has befriended serial killer Mark Nash. Some of you may be familiar with the Grange Gorman murders. Check out our Mike's video of the case. I may cover it myself at some stage. Martina befriended Nash after seeing him when visiting her own murderous brother, and asked the governor for permission to visit him as he had no one. This permission was granted, and she visits Nash now. They phone each other daily and says she will never give up on him. They get on great and he has her down as his next of kin. Martina did say that Nash and Courtney never got on while behind bars, and he regrets encouraging her to join AVP, which is Alternatives to Violence Programs, where she first met Nash. I guess there's nothing much more to say on this case. There's nowt stranger than folk, and this is one case that shows this. Patricia was a beautiful young woman that on a night out got herself into a bit of bother. I'm sure we all have at one stage or another, but we were fortunate enough to make it home, unlike poor Patricia. My heart goes out to her husband Brian, and I do hope he managed to find someone else to love, and to love him back, and who accepts his loss. It was all so very sad, and I hope Patricia is resting in peace.